Yes. Good evening. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Wonderful. Yeah, good evening, everyone. I can't see the room, but it's hard to believe it's been about a year now since I came and spoke to this group towards the beginning of our monitoring effort in the CEI hub. But we wanted to come and give just a quick update on the on that monitoring effort and the conclusion of the monitoring. So just a quick recap of what the monitoring effort was that uh, and sorry, I forgot to introduce myself. I was somewhat introduced, but my name is Brennan White. I'm a Clean Air Act inspector and compliance officer in the Enforcement and Compliance Assurance Division of Region 10, based up here in Seattle. So we are not, as a group, not as used to speaking to the public as Laura and her folks are. But this is an interesting project in that we got to actually do some community engagement and make some of our data public. And so this defense line monitoring project started a year and a half ago now, almost 2 years ago, when we initially used our Clean Air Act Section 114 authority to require 9 of the fuels terminal facilities along the Linton and sorry, Linton and Wilbridge neighborhood areas there to conduct fence line air monitoring for benzene, ethylbenzene, toluene, xylenes, and hexane. So we sent them those requirements to monitor, and all 9 of the facilities cooperated with us and installed fence line air monitoring stations for those air toxics. Each facility put up between 12 and 15-ish of these monitors around their whole fence line, depending on the size and shape of the facility. And that monitoring began actually 2024 in between September and November. Each facility started at a slightly different time. They were staggered due to various considerations and delays in getting the equipment set up. And then each of those facilities monitored for a full year and concluded their monitoring now in September to November of 2025. So, there weren't any major issues there. And we got a full year of data from each of those facilities. That data was designed to be part of, you know, compliance investigations by the enforcement division here in Region 10. So our public engagement and our providing of this information, to you, I know has been slightly frustrating in that this is a compliance enforcement and enforcement investigation that we can't talk very openly about, and we can't talk about ongoing enforcement cases that came out of any of that data. Uh, but those any settlements that happen will be public after they're concluded. Uh, but we did want to make this data public because we knew that there's a strong community interest in this whole area, as your presence here shows. And that data is fully available now and complete on the CEI Hub Fence Line Monitoring website, which I just posted into the chat. So, the frustration here is that this fence line monitoring is not designed to show any, health impacts or risks. It's not where you would usually monitor or the method you would usually monitor to establish those that type of risk-based data analysis. I do know that uh, our friends over at Oregon DEQ in the Cleaner Air Oregon office were willing to take our data and put their eyes on it and look at it from their perspectives and their limits and modeling. And they had a conversation with your Nancy Heiser, and I don't know who else was in that meeting with Cleaner Air Oregon, but they had a talk about their interpretations of this data, which we really appreciate because it's not really something that we're equipped to speak on. And so, any questions about that? I would perhaps have a chat with your group that attended that meeting. And very grateful for J.R. Giska at Cleaner or Oregon for having that meeting with your people. So, in conclusion, we were done with the monitoring. We consider the monitoring a success. The data's up there. At the moment, we don't have any plans to remove that website or remove the data. It should be up there for a while. Uh, and you can find a bit more website on the background and which specific facilities we're monitoring there, including the monitoring locations and some of the numbers and things, as well as view the data on the website. So I think that's all. That's my full update. If anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to answer what I can. Oh, and Laura just put the email for Cleaner Air Oregon in the chat there as well.
Thank you, Brendan. All right. We have a good amount of time. If I'm seeing a hand back here, we'll just go to questions for the next 10-ish minutes.
Hi, Brendan. I didn't quite catch the places where you did the monitoring. I'm sure it's in the information somewhere, but can you repeat that? Where the fence
Yes.
line monitoring happened?
Yeah, so it was almost all the fuel terminals along Wilbridge and Linton.
Okay,
So
right.
Chevron, both Kinder Morgan locations, McCall, Phillips 66, Seaport, Shore, New Star. So they've got about four names at this point since they've been acquired. Shore, New Star, formerly Shore, New Star. Now they are Seaport, I believe. Or no, Seaport's the other one. I forget the new name of Sunoco. I believe is the New Star facility. And then the smaller Shell terminal down in the southern part of Linton and Zenith.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And I see we have a question online asking for the four contaminants that you tested the fence line. Do these substances generally stay closer to the ground or do they rise up further into the sky? Just wondering how the fence line monitoring compares to air quality further. If that's a thing. Sorry, I think there's a little typo there. Also, with the changes proposed to the Clean Air Act at the federal level, how will that affect the monitoring and the acceptable levels of contaminants? So there's a good few questions in there. Most of these substances are heavier than air. That being said, in an urban environment, and I'm not a climatologist or an expert in air modeling, but you get a lot of mixing, warm tanks with warm vapors coming out of them. They will often rise quite a bit, but I think it can be a mix depending on the conditions. And I know you do get temperature inversions right along that region as well, which would keep anything emitted in. So it's a very complicated question whether or not it stays closer to the ground. Uh, so in terms of changes to the Clean Air Act at the federal level, this monitoring is done. This was not a monitoring that was required by any specific Clean Air Act rule that's currently in the CFR. This was a specific investigation that we conducted under our 114 authority because we had specific interest in these facilities. Uh, Generally, that I'm aware of, any proposed changes to our CFR rules would not affect these facilities at the moment. There are some proposed changes to other rules in other industries, but not necessarily these ones that I'm aware of at this time. And then the last part that asks about acceptable levels of contaminants. And so that's where we get into a bit of the more complicated part around enforcement at these types of facilities, where these big fuel tanks, which are the main emission sources at these facilities, the Clean Air Act rules for these tanks don't have specific emission, like numerical emission limits that say you're allowed to emit this much or this concentration from these tanks. It's all work practice and equipment-based rules. So they have to use certain types of tanks, certain types of seals, certain types of pressure relief vents that are sealed, things like that. And it varies by tank depending on what the contents are and what the age of the tank is. Uh, but none of these tanks have numerical emission limits. It's all this work practice based and equipment based equipment rules. So as long as they're using the right type of equipment, they're maintaining it properly, and they're operating it correctly, that's what the rules require. And then those rules are designed to minimize emissions based on those actions and that equipment.
Thank you, Brendan. We have a couple more questions here in person.
Okay.
And this is Doug Larson. Could you generalize about the differences between upwind and downwind on the properties?
We didn't, looking at the sort of patterns in the concentrations, I did not see, and this is really just sort of a qualitative, my eyeballs looking at it, and this is not any sort of complicated modeling. I didn't notice any particular upwind and downwind patterns in the, in this data, just visually on it. And I didn't notice those particularly changing with seasonality either, because I know that your predominant winds shift between the northeast and the southeast in the summer and the winter. I can't remember off the top of my head which direction it's going in each one, but I didn't actually notice a particular pattern that looked like it stemmed from that. Does that answer your question?
Sort of. Are you saying that when you looked at the raw data that the emissions you detected with your monitors on multiple sides of the properties were roughly the same then?
Generally, yes. And one thing I should have mentioned in my introduction, so the monitoring stations that were put up are these little absorbent tubes that are left out there for 2 weeks. So we're getting 2-week averages for the concentration. So with constant wind shifts and things like that, we're not getting live readings on one side of the facility that's upwind and one side of the facility that's downwind. You're getting a 2-week average over that whole period of the concentration at that point. So that makes it kind of quite difficult to, unless there's really consistent wind patterns, you're not really going to see it.
Okay, thank you.
All right, another question?
Sure. Hi there. Cassie Cohen with Portland Harbor Community Coalition. So I know that EPA, well, the current administration did away with any gains that EPA had around addressing cumulative impacts. So I'm wondering, kind of like real time here and now with this kind of a study, what are you doing, if anything, to not just like look at the samples in isolation, but are you looking at like the cumulative additive impact of all of those samples? And because this is kind of the major concern that has been bubbling up for many, many years of communities surrounding these areas, Portland Harbor Superfund site and the CEI hub, and like all the industry around that area too that's very active, and the freeways and the exhaust. And so just like the layering of all of those impacts over time, over generations too. So yeah, just curious, like, how do you, how can EPA acknowledge the cumulative nature of what's going on too?
That's a very big question. That's, I'm afraid, outside of my bailiwick. So as I mentioned earlier, this sampling was part of an enforcement and compliance investigation, specifically to look at whether or not these facilities were following the rules. And this sampling was not designed to measure health risks or health-based outcomes from these air emissions in any way. That wasn't part of our mandate under this part of the Clean Air Act that we ruled, nor what our office does. That's where I'm very glad that Cleaner Air Oregon was willing to do some analysis and step in on that. So I would defer that question to them, I'm afraid. It's a very good one, and I'd love to know the answer myself.
Feels like it's ongoing. And if you could introduce yourself.
So I'm Dory Sweller, and I'm on the board of the Linton Neighborhood Association, and I used to work on CAG for a very long time. So I'm wondering, did you find any seasonal changes in the amount of emissions coming off from the tank farms, since we know that the CEI hub is a heat island?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And again, this is mostly going off of my fairly qualitative analysis of this, but we didn't see as much seasonal difference as we thought we would. We saw very minimal seasonal changes, and actually, some of the relatively higher readings, not necessarily that they were higher concerning any way, but a lot of the relatively higher readings were actually in the shoulder seasons. Um, and my hypothesis around that we don't really have a way of confirming, is that it has to do with warm temperatures combined and interacting with seasonal fuel blends. So if some of you may be aware, but gasoline has a different mixture and ingredient list in the summer than in the winter. And in the summer, it's less volatile, and the winter fuel blend is more volatile because it needs to work in your engine and volatilize more in a cold engine. So winter fuel blends are actually a lot more volatile than summer fuel blends. And I think what we were seeing in some of the slightly higher readings that we saw in those shoulder seasons was when we had some warmer temperatures and still had some of that, but had some of that winter fuel blend in the tanks. But again, they were quite minor differences generally.
Thank you. Online, yeah, we can. Yeah, let's transition to an online question and we'll come back.
Okay, I'm seeing one. Are there any opportunities for continued monitoring by agencies or community organizations? I mean, so community organizations, absolutely. I mean, I don't. It depends on your resources and willingness to take things on. Agencies, I mean, the EPA maintains its 114 authority. We could and probably will at some point do some project like this in the future. I don't know where that would be at this time. There's no current plans for it in Region 10. Uh, Currently, there are rules in the regulations for refineries that requires them to do some similar monitoring to this around benzene. In fact, the methods that we followed for this monitoring were based on those methods that were developed for benzene monitoring at refineries. So refineries do have fence line monitoring. There are certain other cases where facilities are asked to or required to perform monitoring along their fence lines, more on a case-by-case basis. But we don't have any current plans that I'm aware of, at least from an enforcement perspective, to require any more monitoring in Region 10 in the near future here.
Okay, in the interest of time, this will be the last one, so take it away.
Great. Mary Pivotot, Neighbors for Clean Air. Thank you, Brendan. I'm curious if you can speak to the original impetus for the investigation, and so what caused EPA's Office of Enforcement to monitor in this area? And is it unusual for EPA to be considering 9 different entities in one potential case? Or I'm kind of just curious what the reason was that EPA took this action to monitor.
Sure, I can partially answer it. I can't go into details in terms of some things around enforcement cases and or the enforcement cases or investigations. But first of all, this is very unusual. This is, to my knowledge, the first sort of enforcement effort like this in the country. So yes, and part of it was that we were hearing quite a few concerns around these facilities. There were a lot of odor complaints. There were a lot of things like that from the community, and those were getting passed along from people in your group and others to our office. Um, we had concerns because these facilities are very near to a lot of places where a lot of people live, and that combined with the uh, with the complaints that we were hearing, there were some previous enforcement priorities that were put out to focus on urban air toxics in communities like yours, like Linton and Wilbridge. So, that was some of the impetus here. And then, we designed, and we would consider this 9 different investigations into each of these facilities separately. But we viewed it as a way it would have been very hard if we did one at a time to differentiate emissions from neighbors, essentially. So we wanted to conduct all 9 investigations at the same time so that we could actually differentiate and make sure we weren't blaming one facility for potential emissions from the next facility over.